August 26, 1938. Austria was under Nazi rule, and Czechoslovakia seemed to be next. The world was on the brink of a new war. In Paris, a room full of famed economists met to discuss the future of liberalism, the ideology that had shaped the West for the last 100 years. Held in Europe and attended mostly by Europeans, it was at the behest of an American journalist. Walter Lippmann was a co-founder of the New Republic magazine and widely seen as the intellectual bedrock of the New Deal. Liberal, as an adjective, was only beginning to refer to the soft social democratic reformism of Roosevelt, and Lippmann was fated as the augur of a new era. Lippmann was a socialist as a young man, but after graduating from Harvard, he thought the greatest hope for mankind lay in the progressivism of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Indeed, Lippmann helped draft the famous 14 Points for Peace in 1918 as an advisor to Wilson. Like Wilson, Lippmann believed in scientific governance that guided people in every aspect of life. This extended to breeding, and Lippmann was a proud proponent of eugenics up until the Second World War. However, his ideological underpinning continued to evolve, as he identified less with the progressives and more with a small core of what were beginning to be called Neoliberals. Neoliberals defended some basic aspects of what would be called a liberal world order, such as had existed in Western Europe after 1919, constitutional democracies, rule of law, and rejection of totalitarianism. Unlike the latter-day liberals, as Lippmann called them, he rejected inalienable rights and laissez-faire economics. Lippmann and the neoliberals disdained Herbert Spencer and the remnants of old liberalism in America and the rest of the West. John Maynard Keynes and his idea of controlled capitalism, ending the foolishly suicidal animal spirits of free men and free markets, appealed greatly to Lippmann, and the journalists lavished praise upon him. Ironically, however, the man known then and now as Keynes's greatest enemy, Ludwig von Mises, was also influential among the neoliberals, but they were very selective with what they took from Mises. Economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth was used to smash the idea of Marxist socialism as the ideal society. Without a price system and the ability to economize, even a gradual path to full government planning of the economy was closed off forever. Smaller-scale forms of market interventions, however, were considered not just fine but essential to the neoliberals despite Mises's warning about the danger of middle-of-the-road policies. To neoliberals and their allies, such as the Chicago schooler Frank Knight, the firm was simply a policy tool created by and for the use of the state, not a locus of human action. Mises and his student Friedrich von Hayek were still friendly with Lippmann, however, and both happened to be invited to the colloquium, despite both having left the nation of their birth ahead of Hitler's Anschluss. Hayek at the time was teaching at the London School of Economics, butting heads with Keynes and the socialists there. But Fritz, too, had fallen prey to the allure of the middle road. In early 1933, he had written to Mises, quote, "The only difference in our views refers to the question to what extent the acceptance of the principle of private property solves in itself all the problems of economic policy and, respectively, to what extent interferences into the property of one person are necessitated by the protection of the property of another person. In order to make the idea of liberalism comprehensible, it appears to me that a rather casuistic elaboration is very important, just to make clear that the position of the new liberalism is not that of laissez-faire." Even Hayek's somewhat squishier liberalism was under full assault at LSE, where Keynes had become a superstar and Hayek had failed to produce a sufficient refutation of Keynes's magnum opus, the general theory. By 1938, he was somewhat isolated, intellectually if not personally, with the only other prominent classical liberal fellow at LSE, Edwin Cannon, having died 3 years before. Mises arrived in Paris prepared to do what he had done for the past decade, to fight tooth and nail for laissez-faire from attacks from both the left and right. As economic advisor to the Austrian government, he had tirelessly advocated for trade freedom, for fiscal responsibility, and for hard money, even at the height of the Great Depression. The Christian Social Party that ruled interwar Austria hated and feared socialism under the banner of the left, but was not as fast to resist the socialism of the right, draped in fatherland, faith, and family. Farm subsidies, infant industry tariffs, and other blue-coded wealth transfers were always opposed by Mises, but not always successfully. By 1938, he had begun to suspect his time in Europe was coming to an end. His well-paying contract as a professor at the Graduate Institute in Geneva was almost concluded, and his family was no longer safe in Nazi-ruled Austria. In Paris, Mises found a pair of allies against Keynesianism, the Frenchmen Étienne Mantoux and Jacques Rueff. Mantou's father, Paul, had actually founded the Geneva Institute as political commissioner for the League of Nations. And while not as stalwart as Mises on total laissez-faire, Étienne did not think classical liberalism was a passing thing to be discarded like an obsolete tool, and respected the Austrian tradition of Mises and Hayek. Mantoux died in the service of the Free French Army a week and a day before VE Day, too late to see his scathing indictment of Keynes's economic appraisal of the Treaty of Versailles, titled The Calumniated Peace, published in 1946. Jacques Rueff also served the League of Nations in Geneva before rising in the ranks of the Finance Ministry of France to become its most senior official in 1936. Despite the government in power being a left-wing popular front, Rueff, like Mises, stubbornly held on to fiscal responsibility and monetary tightness, even while much of the Western world had embraced some form of Keynesianism to try and dig itself out of the Depression. He remained in his station until September 1939 and left public life after the fall of France and the anti-Semitic policies of Pétain. He would return to have a major impact on world finance, being the man behind de Gaulle calling the U.S. bluff on the gold exchange rate and forcing Nixon to close the gold window set up at Bretton Woods in 1944. The Bretton Woods system was a large monetary subsidy to the U.S. at the expense of other developed countries, and Rueff's shrewd Austrian analysis allowed him to finally alleviate the inflation the French had suffered since the 1950s. Along with the Frenchmen, there were two highly respected German economists, Wilhelm Röpke and Alexander Rustow. Both had to flee Hitler's Germany in 1933, with Rustow subsiding in Geneva, another graduate institute hire, and Röpke in Istanbul. Both men were sympathetic to the neoliberalism, and it was Rustow who proposed to name the principles passed at the conference, more on that later, as specifically neoliberal. After the war, they returned to Germany to offer their economic expertise and are considered the founders of the modern German economy. Their liberal interventionist ideas took form as ordoliberalism and the distinct German market economy. While veering in significant ways from Misesian prescriptions, the original ordoliberals were still, like the rest of the Lippmannites, Austrian in important ways, not wanting to tamper with private property in irreversible ways and pushing against social democracy. Quote Röpke speaking in 1958, "In spite of its alluring name, the welfare state stands or falls by compulsion. It is compulsion imposed upon us with the state's power to punish noncompliance. Once this is clear, it is equally clear that the welfare state is an evil, the same as each and every restriction of freedom. Their interest in fiscal discipline as well is still a prominent feature of German economic statecraft to this day." Having covered the major participants, there were 26 attendees in total, let us come to the actual events of the colloquium. Louis Rougier, the organizer of the colloquium, inaugurates the conference with lavish praise of the guest of honor, Lippmann, and his new book, The Good Society. As an aside, Rougier himself in old age rejected liberalism for the authoritarian far right in France, specifically the neo-pagan organization GLUS, under the tutelage of Alain de Benoit. After Rougier's induction, Lippmann takes the stand and gives a speech savagely attacking classical liberalism for its perceived faults. Quote, "In the presence of the debacle of 19th century liberalism, it would be futile for them to calmly await the resurrection of Mr. Gladstone and to believe that their mission consists in repeating the formulas of the last century. We have covered William Gladstone, record four-time Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, in a previous video, one that actually cited an observation of Hayek that by 1944 Gladstone, once a giant of politics, was derided by the British intellectual class far more than Otto von Bismarck. It's ironic that Lippmann singles out Gladstone, since after his death in 1898, his Liberal Party, once a shining beacon of laissez-faire, had done much of what Lippmann thought was the supposed solution to this crisis of liberalism was, if not perhaps to the full extent of his liking. The Liberal Party of Herbert Asquith and Lloyd George inaugurated the welfare state, defended imperialism, and empowered the unelected bureaucracy, the civil service, against the people. The Rump Liberal Party, which a sympathetic Hayek had watched in deep gloom as it faded into the wilderness of third-partydom in 1931 from LSE, was anything but classically liberal, and didn't advertise itself as such. When Lippmann ended his speech, discussion began. Immediately the subject shifted to the terms to be used. The French economist Louis Baudin says individualism must be favored over liberalism for Lippmann's vision, saying liberalism was too poisoned by the likes of Frédéric Bastiat, his disciple the proto-ANCAP de Molinari, and his disciple French politician Yves Guillot, an anti-war, pro-civil liberties, and free trade extremist who could be favorably compared to Ron Paul from the 21st century. Rougier, the dean of the conference, counters that individualism would be connected with Stirner and the license to overpower the wills of others, although we have a video that shows Stirner was in fact a market anarchist, not a nihilist nor communist. The following day, Mises, who during the previous discussion had confined himself to minor etymological points, took Rupke to task over the common myth of corporate concentration under capitalism. What Rupke introduced as a natural progression of cartelization and monopoly, Mises showed using Rupke's own German homeland as a specific political program of coercive economic centralization. Not only had the usual suspects of government intervention in the sense of strangling competition occurred, but the German government had in major industries forced firms to cartelize. Hayek, too, raises an important point against this inevitable technological progression leads to market concentration thesis. Quote, if corporate concentration were due to a natural technological development, its form should first be horizontal integration, the concentration in the same stage of production, and then vertical integration, concentration of all the stages of production for a given good. However, the most widespread forms are forms of vertical integration and only secondarily horizontal integration, exactly the opposite of what technological orientation suggests. After several other discussions regarding liberal economies during war, the concept of economic nationalism, that is, protectionism, and the so-called social question regarding the defensibility of the welfare state, for which Mises and Hayek added brief but predictable critiques. The last major discussion was led by Alexander Rousteau. The topic: is the decline of liberalism due to non-economic causes, be they psychological, sociological, etc.? Rousteau's contention was that while liberalism delivers the goods in terms of standards of living rising, it fails to give people a sense of purpose. Spontaneous order that arises from market forces perplexes the masses, who look for answers to their problems in demagogues, who give them a sense of unity and do away with the anxiety of choice. It is in this way, Rousteau argues, that liberalism has failed against the rising tide of totalitarianism. The alternative must be a strong state that, while protecting the basic structure of liberalism, gives these masses what they need, through economic intervention if necessary. Mises points out that both the left and right totalitarians promise primarily not intangible gains, but economic ones when they reach out to the masses. Quote, in asserting, for example, that cannons are more essential to them than butter, they imply, the cannons will enable us to conquer the means to create thereafter a state of greater well-being. If they demand sacrifices of their countrymen, they reckon that these sacrifices will only be temporary in scope and will be more than offset afterwards by the results of a policy of this kind. Only writers and theorists extol the idea of a life of poverty. Demagogues always dangle before the masses the prospect of an improvement of their living conditions. Mises would go on to write a book in 1956 after the war called The Anti-Capitalist Mentality that covers many often romantic and psychological arguments against free markets and takes them to task. The conference came to an end on August 30th, 1938. That morning, Rougier laid out a series of points for which there was a broad consensus. In addition to Lippmann's initial principles that the new liberalism must protect private property and the price mechanism while also using the law as a guiding tool for this means, The state would be allowed a role in the 5 following areas: national defense, social insurance, social services, education, and scientific research. In Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, published in 1960, he more or less acquiesces to this limited interventionist state. Mises is silent in this consensus as far as the transcript shows. During the afternoon session, meant to set a basis for follow-up research, however, he voices one last grave concern. Quote, "It is effectively beyond any doubt that the main problem to study will be that of the possibilities of and of the limits to interventionism. This colloquium should be prepared through the development of a report on the way in which economists have until now considered the matter." Mises, it is true, was not an anarchist. He believed in the legitimacy and economic necessity of a state, that law and justice could not be privatized. But he explained in 1950, policies that seek to find some golden mean between laissez-faire and socialism will always create ever more crises for which the obvious solution will be ever more intervention. The liberals who wanted to preserve the price mechanism and private property by sacrificing some laissez-faire were the men who feed a tiger hoping it will eat them last. A month after the conference concluded, Germany received the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. The totalitarian states ravaged Europe until 1991, and liberalism seemingly emerged victorious. True, it was a somewhat more rightward neoliberalism than Lippmann had anticipated. However, if one were to look at the concluding points of agreement, you will not find Margaret Thatcher or Milton Friedman disagreeing with any of them. And as Mises predicted, the middle-of-the-road policies led to many disasters and disastrous emergency solutions. Mises may have left the conference feeling isolated and alone, almost the last man to defend laissez-faire. Less than 2 years after the colloquium, Mises and his wife would take a desperate bus ride down from the Alps to get to neutral Spain as the Axis stormed across France. He would spend the rest of his life in the United States, depending on his friend Hayek during the war years to send him books bought with his London bank account to sell to make a living. The British state had banned money itself being sent abroad. But during his time in America, he would meet a collection of stalwart men dedicated to liberalism in its old, true sense. One of those men was a young Murray Rothbard. He and a handful of others would jumpstart an Austrian Renaissance in America, which eventually spread to the world. Javier Milei is a deep admirer of Mises and Rothbard, and a deep hater of both socialism and its milquetoast neoliberal cousin. The Lippmann Conference may have killed liberalism temporarily, but today we are seeing its fiery rebirth. Long live liberalism, and may 1,000 flowers bloom.